the spring of 1944, along the treacherous mountain slopes of Monte Cassino in Italy, German Wehrmacht soldiers, entrenched in fortified positions, witnessed something that defied all military logic and common sense. Through their field glasses and observation posts, they watched as Polish soldiers of the Second Corps moved ammunition and supplies toward frontline positions in preparation for what would become one of the most brutal and decisive battles of the Italian campaign. Among the figures moving through the rocky terrain, carrying crates of artillery shells with apparent ease, was a creature that seemed impossible in the context of modern warfare. A fully grown Syrian brown bear, standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing approximately 500 pounds, was transporting 100-pound artillery shells from supply dumps to gun positions, working alongside human soldiers as though this were the most natural thing in the world. The German soldiers, hardened veterans who had seen combat across multiple theaters of war, initially refused to believe what their eyes were telling them. Some thought it was exhaustion playing tricks on their minds. Others suspected it might be some kind of elaborate camouflage or deception. But as the observations continued and reports accumulated, they were forced to confront an extraordinary reality. The Poles had enlisted a bear into their armed forces, and this bear was performing the work of multiple men in one of the most dangerous environments imaginable. This bear was named Wojtek, a name that meant happy warrior, or he who enjoys war in Polish, though the bear himself certainly had no conception of warfare or military service in any human sense. His story began not in the mountains of Italy, but in the mountains of Iran, thousands of miles away, in circumstances that were themselves extraordinary and emblematic of the chaotic, far-reaching nature of the Second World War. In 1942, a young boy in the Hamadan region of Iran found an orphaned bear cub, whose mother had likely been killed by hunters. The cub was malnourished, frightened, and unlikely to survive on its own in the wild. The boy, needing money, and recognizing that the unusual animal might have value, brought the cub to a local market where he hoped to sell it to travelers or merchants passing through the region. At this precise moment in history, tens of thousands of Polish soldiers and civilians were making their way through Iran as part of one of the most remarkable mass movements of the war. These were men, women, and children who had been deported to Soviet labor camps and gulags following the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in 1939. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the strategic calculus changed dramatically, and Stalin, now allied with Britain and in desperate need of every possible resource to fight the German invasion, agreed to release Polish prisoners and allow the formation of a Polish army in exile under General Władysław Anders. These former prisoners, along with their families, were evacuated from the Soviet Union through a grueling journey that took them through Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and eventually into Iran, where British authorities were coordinating their reception and eventual deployment to combat zones. The Polish soldiers who encountered the bear cub in that Iranian market in April of 1942 were men who had experienced unimaginable hardship. They had survived Soviet imprisonment, forced labor, starvation, disease, and a journey across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Many had watched friends and family members die in the camps. They had been stripped of their homeland, their dignity, their sense of purpose, now finally free, and being reconstituted as a fighting force. They were searching for ways to rebuild not just their military capability, but their sense of identity and morale. When Lieutenant Anatol Tarnowicki and several soldiers from the 22nd Artillery Supply Company encountered the bear cub, something in the tiny animal's vulnerability and dependence struck a chord with these hardened men. The soldiers purchased the cub using their own money and whatever goods they could trade. The transaction was simple enough, but the decision to keep the animal represented something more profound than a mere whim or moment of sentimentality. For these soldiers, the bear cub became a living symbol of innocence that needed protection, a creature that depended on them for survival in the same way that Poland itself seemed to depend on the continued resistance and fighting spirit of its exiled forces. The bear gave them something to care for, something to nurture, in a world that had shown them almost nothing but cruelty and loss. In the midst of war and displacement, the act of feeding and caring for this small animal provided a psychological anchor, a reminder of life and growth and possibility in the face of death and destruction. The soldiers named him Wojtek, and from the beginning, they treated him not as a mascot or a pet in the conventional sense, but as a member of their unit. They fed him using a makeshift bottle when he was still small enough to cradle in one arm, mixing condensed milk with water, and sometimes adding honey when they could find it. The bear cub thrived under this care, growing rapidly as young bears do, and as he grew, so did his personality and his integration into the life of the Polish Second Corps. Wojtek was not kept in a cage or restrained in any meaningful way. He wandered freely through the camp, interacting with soldiers, learning behaviors through observation and repetition, becoming socialized in ways that wild bears never experience. As Wojtek matured, his diet expanded beyond milk to include the same rations that the soldiers ate. He developed a particular fondness for beer, which the soldiers would give him as a treat, and he learned to enjoy cigarettes, though he would eat them rather than smoke them in any conventional sense. These habits, which might seem strange or even cruel by contemporary standards of animal welfare, were viewed very differently in the context of wartime military culture. The bear's willingness to share in the vices and comforts of the soldiers reinforced his status as one of them, as a comrade rather than simply an animal under human care. When Wojtek would sit on his haunches and accept a bottle of beer from a soldier, when he would wrestle playfully with men who needed an outlet for physical energy and stress, he was serving a psychological function that went far beyond entertainment. The Polish Second Corps moved from Iran to Iraq, and eventually to Palestine, where they underwent intensive training in preparation for deployment to combat zones. Throughout these movements, Wojtek remained with the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, and his presence created administrative challenges that the Polish military had to address. When the Corps received orders to ship to Italy to join the Allied campaign against German forces, British military authorities who controlled shipping and logistics informed the Poles that animals were not permitted on transport ships. This regulation, sensible enough in its intent, threatened to separate Wojtek from the unit that had cared for him for over 2 years. The Polish soldiers refused to accept this outcome. Wojtek had become too integral to unit identity and morale to be abandoned simply because of bureaucratic regulations. The solution they devised was both creative and telling. They officially enlisted Wojtek into the Polish army with his own paybook, rank, and serial number. He became Private Wojtek, a soldier of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, and as a soldier rather than an animal, he was entitled to rations, quarters, and transportation, just like any other member of the unit. The British authorities, confronted with this bureaucratic fait accompli and perhaps recognizing the importance of morale factors in military effectiveness, accepted the arrangement. Wojtek sailed for Italy as an enlisted member of the Polish Armed Forces, possibly the only bear in history to hold such a distinction. The journey to Italy and the subsequent training period allowed Wojtek to develop skills that would prove crucial during the Monte Cassino campaign. Artillery supply is physically demanding work that requires moving heavy shells from storage areas to gun positions, often under difficult conditions, and sometimes under fire. A typical artillery shell for the 25-pounder guns and larger howitzers that the Polish forces used weighed between 25 and 100 pounds, depending on the caliber. Moving these shells in quantity required significant manual labor, with soldiers forming chains to pass shells from hand to hand or carrying them individually over rough terrain. Wojtek, now weighing several hundred pounds and possessing the natural strength of a mature brown bear, began to participate in these supply operations. The exact process by which he learned to carry ammunition crates is not entirely documented, but it appears to have developed through a combination of observation, imitation, and positive reinforcement. Bears are remarkably intelligent animals with problem-solving abilities and memory that rivals many primates. Wojtek would have observed soldiers lifting and carrying wooden crates, would have seen the patterns of movement from supply dump to gun position, and would have received praise, treats, and attention when he mimicked these behaviors. The soldiers learned to pack artillery shells in wooden crates that Wojtek could grasp with his front paws and carry against his chest while walking upright on his hind legs. This bipedal locomotion, while not the natural movement pattern for bears over long distances, was something Wojtek could sustain for the relatively short trips between supply points. The sight of a 500-pound bear walking upright while carrying a crate of artillery shells must have been extraordinary even to the Polish soldiers who worked with him daily, but for them, it represented the culmination of years of bonding and training, rather than something bizarre or unnatural. The Battle of Monte Cassino, which took place in multiple phases between January and May of 1944, was one of the most challenging operations of the Italian campaign. The ancient Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino sat atop a mountain that dominated the surrounding landscape and controlled access to the Liri Valley and the road to Rome. German forces under General Fridolin von Senger und Ederlin had transformed the mountain and the monastery into a fortress of extraordinary strength. They had created interlocking fields of fire, deep bunkers, minefields, and defensive positions that took full advantage of the terrain. Previous assaults by American, British, New Zealand, and Indian forces had all failed with heavy casualties. The mountain had become a symbol of German defensive capability and Allied frustration. The Polish Second Corps, under the command of General Władysław Anders, was assigned to take the mountain in what would be the fourth and final major assault. The attack was scheduled for May 11, 1944, and would require Polish forces to advance up steep, rocky slopes under fire from well-prepared German positions. The artillery support for this operation was crucial. The Polish gunners would need to lay down sustained barrages to suppress German defensive fire, destroy fortifications, and create opportunities for infantry to advance. This meant that ammunition supply became absolutely critical. The gun positions needed a constant flow of shells to maintain fire rates, and any interruption in supply could mean the difference between success and failure, between breaking through and being pinned down under German counterfire. Wojtek's role in this operation, while perhaps not strategically decisive in the grand scheme of the battle, was nonetheless significant and remarkable. During the intense fighting, he worked alongside human soldiers to move ammunition from supply dumps to forward gun positions. The terrain around Monte Cassino was nightmarishly difficult, with steep inclines, loose rock, craters from previous bombardments, and the constant threat of German artillery and mortar fire. In this environment, Wojtek's strength and sure-footedness gave him advantages that human soldiers did not possess. He could carry loads that would require 2 men to manage, and he could navigate rough ground with the natural agility of an animal adapted to mountainous terrain. The German soldiers, who observed this through their optics and observation posts, struggled to process what they were seeing. Military doctrine and training prepared soldiers for many things, but the possibility of encountering a bear serving in an enemy military unit was not among them. Initial reports were likely met with skepticism by German commanders who assumed that their forward observers were either mistaken or suffering from combat fatigue. The human mind, when confronted with something that does not fit established patterns of understanding, often rejects or reinterprets the information to make it fit existing frameworks. A bear carrying ammunition simply did not fit any framework that German military training or experience had provided. As reports continued, and multiple observers confirmed the sightings, German intelligence officers would have been forced to take the matter seriously. They would have tried to understand whether this represented some kind of tactical innovation, whether there was strategic significance to the use of animals in this way, whether it indicated something about Polish supply capabilities or desperation. The presence of a bear might have seemed to suggest that the Poles were so short of manpower that they were resorting to animals to fill gaps, or it might have suggested the opposite, that they had resources and creativity beyond what German intelligence had assessed. In reality, it was neither. Wojtek's participation was a unique circumstance born of a specific history and relationship, not a broader policy or capability. For the Polish soldiers fighting at Monte Cassino, Wojtek's presence served functions that went beyond his physical contribution to ammunition supply. He was a living connection to their journey, from Soviet imprisonment, through Iran to this battlefield in Italy. He represented continuity, resilience, and the preservation of humanity in the face of dehumanizing war. When soldiers saw Wojtek calmly carrying shells while artillery fire crashed around them, when they watched this animal performing his tasks with apparent unconcern for the danger, it provided a psychological boost that is difficult to quantify but nonetheless real. If a bear could function under these conditions, then surely they could as well. If this creature that they had nurtured and trained was doing his part, then they were obligated to do theirs. The battle for Monte Cassino lasted for days of intense, brutal combat. Polish forces suffered thousands of casualties as they fought their way up the mountain against determined German resistance. The fighting was close range, savage and exhausting. Both sides displayed extraordinary courage and tenacity. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew that losing Monte Cassino meant losing the key to the entire defensive position, while the Poles fought with the fury of men who were determined to prove their worth and reclaim honor for a nation that had been occupied and divided by its enemies. Eventually, on May 18, 1944, Polish soldiers raised their flag over the ruins of the monastery. The Germans, recognizing that their position had become untenable, had withdrawn during the night, and the mountain that had resisted so many assaults finally fell. Wojtek emerged from the battle unharmed, though he had worked throughout the fighting in conditions that killed or wounded thousands of men. His survival was partly luck, and partly the fact that artillery supply positions, while certainly dangerous, were not on the absolute front line where casualties were highest. In recognition of his service during the battle, the 22nd Artillery Supply Company changed its official emblem to feature the image of a bear carrying an artillery shell. This emblem was more than mere sentimentality. It was an official acknowledgement that Wojtek had earned his place in the unit's history and identity through actual service under fire, rather than simply as a mascot or curiosity. After Monte Cassino, the Polish Second Corps continued to fight in Italy, participating in the advance northward and the eventual defeat of German forces in the Italian theater. Wojtek remained with the unit throughout, continuing to live among the soldiers who had raised him. As the war progressed and victory became increasingly certain, thoughts turned to what would happen after demobilization. The Polish soldiers faced an uncertain future. Their homeland had been liberated from German occupation only to fall under Soviet control. Many of them could not return to Poland without facing persecution from the communist government that Stalin had installed. They would become permanent exiles, settling in Britain, America, and other countries that would accept them. When the 22nd Artillery Supply Company was demobilized in 1947, arrangements had to be made for Wojtek's care. The soldiers who had been his companions and caretakers were scattering to different countries and different lives. They could not take a 500-pound bear with them as they attempted to rebuild civilian lives in a post-war world that had little room for such extraordinary companions. After much consideration, and with great reluctance, they arranged for Wojtek to be housed at the Edinburgh Zoo in Scotland. This was not abandonment, but rather the most practical solution they could devise to ensure his continued care and safety. Wojtek lived at Edinburgh Zoo for the remainder of his life, until his death in 1963 at the age of 21. He was a popular attraction, and many former Polish soldiers who had settled in Britain would visit him regularly, bringing him cigarettes and treats, speaking to him in Polish, reconnecting with a living symbol of their wartime experience. For these men, now working ordinary jobs and living ordinary lives far from their homeland. Wojtek represented a tangible link to extraordinary times, to a period when they had fought with purpose and clarity against an enemy that represented absolute evil. The bear had aged along with them, had survived the war along with them, and in his comfortable captivity, he served as a reminder that survival itself was a kind of victory. The story of Wojtek resonated beyond the Polish community and became part of the broader narrative of the Second World War. It represented the human capacity to find connection and meaning, even in the midst of industrial-scale violence and destruction. It demonstrated that warfare, while certainly a realm of strategy and material and violence, is also a fundamentally human endeavor shaped by emotion, by relationships, by the psychological needs that persist even under the most extreme conditions. The soldiers who bought that orphaned cub at an Iranian market in 1942 were not acting according to military logic or tactical consideration. They were acting from emotional need, from a desire to protect and nurture something vulnerable in a world that had shown them how vulnerable they themselves were. The German soldiers who witnessed Wojtek carrying ammunition at Monte Cassino were seeing something that military science and doctrine had not prepared them for, but they were also seeing something deeply human. They were seeing the result of men choosing to care for a creature that served no obvious military purpose, investing time and resources and emotional energy in raising an animal that could have been abandoned at any point. That this bear ended up contributing to military operations in a measurable way was almost beside the point. The real significance was that human beings in the midst of total war had chosen to preserve life and build relationships rather than simply becoming machines of destruction. The phenomenon of Wojtek, the soldier bear of Monte Cassino, stands as one of the most unusual and touching stories to emerge from the Second World War. It reminds us that history is made not just by generals and politicians making grand strategic decisions, but also by ordinary soldiers making small human choices that accumulate into something larger. The Polish soldiers who enlisted a bear into their army were not trying to make history or create a legend. They were simply trying to hold on to something good and pure in a world that seemed to have lost all goodness and purity. That they succeeded, that they brought this animal through years of war and multiple campaigns and kept him safe despite all the dangers, speaks to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of compassion, even in the darkest times.